Okay, again, welcome. Today's webinar is Becoming Gluten-Free Certified with NSF. A few points to mention before we get started. The webinar has been started in mute mode to minimize disruptions. If you have questions, use the chat feature in the bottom left side of the screen. And a copy of the presentation will be emailed to attendees that provided their email and contact information during the online registration. Now I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce myself. As I said, I'm Marcy Burton. I'm the Business Development Manager for NSF International's Consumer Values Verified Business Unit. I have a master's degree from Oregon State University in Crop and Soil Science, and I've been with NSF for the last 4 years. I'll give you a little overview of what we'll cover in today's webinar. We'll discuss the FDA Gluten-Free Final Rule, NSF's certification requirements, the certification process, and then we will have a section for questions and answers at the end of the webinar. So let's begin by reviewing the FDA Final Rule. So on August 2nd, 2013, the FDA issued a rule defining gluten-free for food labeling, which helps consumers, especially those living with celiac disease, have confidence that items labeled gluten-free meet a defined standard for gluten content. The compliance date of this final rule was August 5th, 2014, and we'll cover what this means in more details in future slides. The regulation provides a uniform standard for manufacturers who choose to label their products as gluten-free. It also helps the estimated 1 in every 133 people, which is about 3 million people in the United States, who have celiac disease. And that's a condition that can only be managed by eating a gluten-free diet. This new federal definition standardized the meaning of gluten-free claims across the food industry. And it requires that in order to use the term gluten-free on its label, a food must meet all the requirements of the definition, including that the food must contain less than 20 parts per million of gluten. The rule also requires foods with claims no gluten, free of gluten, and without gluten to meet the definition for gluten-free. The final rule to define the term gluten-free when labeling foods is voluntary. This means that if a manufacturer chooses to use the term gluten-free on their packaging or another variation of the claim, then the manufacturer shall comply with gluten-free labeling of goods final rule. The final rule establishes requirements for the voluntary use of gluten-free labels. And the Food Allergen Labeling and Consumer Protection Act of 2004 directed the Secretary of Health of Human Services to issue federal regulations that define and permit the use of the term gluten-free on the labeling of foods. The final rule defines and sets conditions on the use of the term gluten-free in foods, including foods that inherently do not contain gluten and may use the gluten-free claim. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail when we discuss global considerations later. The final rule states that foods with any whole gluten-containing grains as ingredients may not use the claim. An example would be spelt wheat. Foods with ingredients that are gluten-containing grains that are refined but still contain more than 20 parts per million gluten, such as wheat flour, may not use the claim. The final rule applies to all FDA-regulated foods, including dietary supplements. And the rule excludes those foods whose labeling is regulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. And generally, the USDA regulates the labeling of meat, poultry, and certain egg products, and the Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau regulates the labeling of most alcoholic beverages, including all distilled spirits, wines that contain 7% or more alcohol by volume. And that also includes malted beverages that are made with malted barley and hops. And the rule does not cover cosmetics or drug products. Not yet. The final rule does go on to state that foods with ingredients that are gluten-containing grains that have refined in such a way to remove the gluten may use the claim, so long as the food contains less than 20 parts per million or 20 milligrams of gluten per kilogram. So foods may not use the claim if they contain 20 parts per million or more gluten as a result of cross-contact with gluten-containing grains. And we will get into more detail on what this means for NSF gluten-free certification. So what are fermented foods? So we're going to get into a little more detail on what is required for fermented foods and hydrolyzed foods with the rule. So a fermented food is one that has undergone a process that typically involves the conversion of complex organic compounds, especially sugars and other carbohydrates, to simpler compounds such as lactic acid or ethyl alcohol. And this process is referred to as fermentation. So during fermentation, proteins are broken apart into smaller groups or peptides. And examples of this would include fermented foods such as beer, yogurt. And a hydrolyzed food is one which a food's chemical components such as proteins are broken into smaller organic compounds by a reaction with water. So these reactions are often accelerated by enzymes. And these would include soy protein and hydrolyzed wheat protein. Because the current tests do not adequately detect and quantify gluten in fermented and hydrolyzed foods or ingredients, the FDA proposes that in order to make a gluten-free claim on these such products, manufacturers of these foods would have to make and record records to show all of the following. So the food meets the definition for gluten-free, as in 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 101.91, including that the food has less than 20 parts per million gluten before the fermentation or hydrolysis process. The manufacturer adequately evaluates the process for any potential for gluten cross-contamination, and where a potential for gluten cross-contamination has been identified, the manufacturer has implemented measures to prevent the introduction of gluten into the food during the manufacturing process. On November 18, 2015, the Food and Drug Administration published a proposed rule to establish requirements for fermented, hydrolyzed, and distilled foods or ingredients that are labeled as gluten-free. And what was proposed was that the compliance methods for these types of foods that bear a voluntary gluten-free labeling claim, and that is in, again, Section 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 101.91. And that is that to define the term gluten-free for voluntary use in the labeling of foods, the manufacturer, again, must be able to show that the fermentation media before fermentation was less than 20 parts per million, and show there is a system in place for cross-contamination. So now let's walk through the NSF certification requirements for certifying an on-label gluten-free claim. So the purpose of the NSF gluten-free protocol is to provide test methods and evaluation criteria for gluten-free products to determine that the ingredients in the product are accurately identified as gluten-free and the product does not contain unacceptable quantities of gluten. It also provides criteria for determining compliant manufacturing practices to be followed in the production of the gluten-free products. And the scope of the protocol is intended for the production of gluten-free products, and it includes the necessary steps to manufacture, store, and transport gluten-free products, both in a facility with shared equipment and facilities with dedicated gluten-free production lines. The manufacturing of gluten-free products is verified through the use of program review, third-party inspections, and independent product testing. The levels referenced in the protocol are consistent with the FDA regulations that we just discussed. So really there are three major requirements of the NSF gluten-free protocol that a company must comply with in order to become certified. First is that a company seeking certification needs to complete a gluten-free compliance plan and comply to every section of the compliance plan. And we'll review the details in the next steps. There is also the requirement for finished product testing. And finished products testing is a requirement that every facility seeking verification or certification must comply with in order to label their products gluten-free. And lastly, every facility seeking certification must undergo an on-site inspection in order to confirm that the facility is complying to all of the requirements stated in the gluten-free protocol. During the on-site inspection, the auditor will pull samples from the products seeking certification and send them to the laboratory for testing. And now let's get into more of the specific details for these three steps. So as I mentioned, you'll be required to complete a gluten-free compliance plan. This contains 7 sections, and it's an overview of the manufacturing process in your facility and how you plan to prevent commingling and cross-contamination of gluten-containing ingredients. So Section A, we're going to ask you a bit about the manufacturing overview. We'll get some information on flow charts and product information. Then we'll get into section about product integrity. We'll want to know specifically what steps and protocols do you have in place for commingling and cross-contamination to prevent the commingling and cross-contamination of raw ingredients, finished products, and packaged and storing containers receiving through the product distribution. There is a section on packaging materials. Those are part of the scope. And storage containers, final packaging, and shipping containers must not contain gluten and must maintain a gluten-free integrity of the product. Section D will be information in regards to your cleaning and sanitation procedures. There must be methods in place to prevent commingling and cross-contamination and demonstrate consistent sanitation procedures. And Section E is where your gluten testing procedures will be described. So with the NSF gluten protocol, finished products must be tested in-house. There must be a sampling and testing plan. So this should be submitted with the initial application for review. And this is, at a minimum, the first sellable unit of each lot of product seeking verification. And this product must test below 15 parts per million. Section S is going to be about record keeping and audit trail procedures. So you must have a good method for maintaining all documents that demonstrate compliance and a method for handling complaints associated with gluten-free compliance. And lastly, Section G is for any additional information that needs to be shared with NSF. So as I mentioned, the protocol requires that internal quality control testing be performed on a minimum of the first unit of sellable product of each production line per lot. The finished product is considered compliant if it's found to have a gluten level of 15 parts per million or less. If a product has a level greater than 15 parts per million or greater than 20 parts per million, it is considered non-compliant, and the company must notify NSF within 48 hours. So with the NSF gluten-free protocol, raw material testing is not required, but documentation must be submitted for each raw material to show that it is less than 20 parts per million. So this can include specification sheets with a gluten statement, allergen statements, COAs with a gluten statement, or you may also have a gluten testing protocol in place at the facility as long as each lot is tested. And that is 20 parts per million for raw materials, and finished products must be compliant at 15 parts per million or less. So now we'll review the gluten-free certification process that will help you to become NSF gluten-free certified. So some of you have already started this, but the first steps to gluten-free certification include the application and quote. You can contact me to tell me about your facility, number of products that you're seeking certification for, and you'll get a quote and a contract to work with NSF. The next step would be the complete application review. This is where we'll collect the compliance plan, the standard operating procedures that you have for segregation and traceability, the raw material documentation to show less than 20 parts per million, the finished testing protocol that's in-house at your facility, and any formulas, ingredients, labels, etc. This goes through our application review with our technical team. They review your information and provide a report of any additional items that are needed for clarification or compliance. At this time, you'll respond to that report. Once all those items have been submitted to your dedicated project manager, it will be time to schedule the on-site inspection. So the inspection is scheduled. The third-party auditor will come to the facility and ensure that what you said is happening on paper is happening at the facility. And this is where they'll also do the sample selection for each family of products. And a family of products is determined by like processes and like ingredients. So products seeking certification must be running on the day of inspection. And then we go to the secondary review. That's once the inspection report is submitted, and then it goes on to the final review and certification. And we'll get into a little more details here. So as I mentioned, the initial step is to contact the business development manager to get information on the program and basic information on your number of facilities involved in handling the products and the number of products seeking certification. And then we'll get a quote and a contract and then a deposit for the application review. In the second step, we'll collect that required documentation that I mentioned. And that includes, again, the gluten-free compliance plan, and that's with the SOPs and procedures in place for the manufacturing, distribution, and consumption of the finished product that you've listed on the gluten compliance plan. And then we'll also get into details about the products you're looking to certify. So we'll get an individual product profile form or a single ingredient product profile, and this is essentially a formula of the product seeking certification. We'll get an input supplier list that will list each input used in these products by supplier. And then we will also collect labels for each product. And then, as I mentioned, we will get the raw material documentation indicating that the ingredients used in these products contain less than 20 parts per million gluten. At this time, it goes to our technical review team to perform essentially a gap analysis and let you know if additional items are needed for clarification or items are needed to demonstrate compliance. Once the application review is complete, you'll be issued a letter of items needed from your certification project manager. And this again addresses any missing or incomplete or inconsistent documentation that's needed for you to continue the process. And your certification project manager will work with you closely to get that information submitted. Once that's submitted, we'll schedule the on-site inspection with an NSF-trained inspector at your facility. The inspector will verify that the procedures documented in your gluten-free compliance plan are implemented and that the product and ingredient information you submitted is accurate. The NSF inspector will also pull a sample of finished product seeking certification to be sent to an NSF lab for gluten analysis, again to confirm it's less than 15 parts per million. The number of samples collected will be determined in the initial application review, and you'll be notified which products have been selected. After the on-site inspection, a secondary review is conducted where a reviewer will evaluate your inspection report and identify any non-compliances. So the inspector will just make observations, but ultimately it's NSF's decision to identify any non-compliances. You will have a time frame to address any non-compliances prior to final certification and issuance of your gluten-free certificate. And it's important to note that the label for your products with the NSF gluten-free logo or statement should not be printed until your certification process is complete and you have received your gluten-free certificate. So products are not allowed to be sold until the certification process is complete. And the final step is certification. Once you have completed all steps just discussed, you will be issued a gluten-free certificate and summary plan that lists the products gluten-free certified by NSF. And at this time, you'll be able to use the gluten-free logo or statement on your products. And there's a sample here on this slide showing the gluten-free logo, certified NSF gluten-free. In order to maintain your NSF gluten-free certification, you will undergo an annual renewal. Your certification project manager will notify you 4 months before your renewal date, which will allow plenty of time to schedule the inspection and sampling, which is a part of the renewal process. And during your annual on-site inspections, any changes to procedures or documents should be shared with your inspector, and any updated forms should be provided to NSF for review. So you may decide to add products to your gluten-free certification throughout the year, and if you choose to do so, you can contact your project manager when you're ready to add the products, and you'll be required to submit product information such as the gluten-free integrity document from each ingredient and supplier, showing less than 20 parts per million, to include the formula and a label. If the product is considered a new category for your facility, there may be a mid-year inspection that's scheduled for the auditor just to come in and pull a sample of that product. So that's a basic overview of the NSF certification process, and we have some time for questions here that may be specific to your operation. You can go ahead and type them into the bottom portion of the screen. So here's a good question. How long does the certification process last? So it's typically 8 to 12 weeks or 8 to 14 weeks. This really depends on how soon you're ready to run products in your facility, and the inspection can be scheduled. So the timeline varies on how complete the application is when you submit it for initial review, how quickly you respond to those items that have been requested, and then again, how quickly the inspection can be scheduled with one of our auditors. And yes, the logo itself, the one I showed you, was just the English version. There is a bilingual Spanish version and French version.